AMD's Ryzen 5000 Zen 3 CPUs are finally here. I've been hard at work testing them, benchmarking them. Let's see what the numbers are and if they actually live up to all of the hype. Let's get started. Hey guys, thank you for joining me again for another video. Tiago with Classical Technology here. If you like my content, remember to subscribe, hit that notification bell, thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm, makes me happy as well, keeps producing content like this. So today we're going to talk about the much anticipated Ryzen 5000 CPUs, or as AMD calls them, it's going to be their new Zen 3 architecture. Now these are going to be 4 CPUs announced so far: the 5600X, 5800X, 5900X, and the 5950X. We're going to do a review and analysis of each of these CPUs based on 4 different categories. First is going to be performance. Second is going to be the value relative to the performance. Third is going to be the innovation that they bring to the market. And finally, the 4th category is just going to be sort of the aesthetics or the brand appeal in general and how they fit in the marketplace according to what gamers and the enthusiasts are looking for. First, let's talk a little bit about the history and why these CPUs are so important. AMD has been on an absolute roll for the last few generations with Zen 1, Zen 2, and now Zen 3. Basically, they've produced some of the best performing CPUs for the dollar, multi-threaded, multi-core performance year after year, slowly encroaching on what pretty much used to be a market completely dominated by Intel. So the last generation, Ryzen 3000, I think that's when it finally clicked and a lot of people switched over to AMD. Not to say that the Intel CPUs are bad at all. The 10th generation from Intel certainly were still great CPUs, the 10900K boosting all the way up to 5.3 gigahertz for a long time. Due to Intel's advantage in IPC, latency, and clock speed, they were able to maintain an advantage, at least when it came to the gaming sector, against AMD. So pretty much Ryzen 3000, they beat Intel in terms of the price to performance, in terms of multi-threaded performance, of course the value for your dollar, but they couldn't quite beat Intel when it came down to gaming if you wanted to get the maximum amount of performance, especially if you're going to be using something like the RTX 3080 or 3070 or one of these new GPUs that could be easily bottlenecked by a slower performing CPUs. Now, the question became, can Zen 3, with a new architecture with better IPC, lower latency, higher boost clocks, can they finally take the crown away from Intel? So I think with Zen 3, AMD's primary objective was to directly target not only the gamer and enthusiast, but the very heart of the gamer and enthusiast. That's going to mean that they're going to have not only the best performance in terms of multi-threaded performance, in terms of performance per watt, and for the first time, AMD is actually claiming that these are going to be also the new Gaming King CPUs, so pretty much closing the circle to any type of advantage that Intel had over AMD. So that's going to be the point of today's review. Let's see if this actually is going to stand to be true. And of course, when they say something is a Gaming King CPU, of course that's all marketing, but what that actually indicates is that these CPUs are tuned for gaming performance, especially at the high levels that Intel was doing before. So now to test all 4 of these CPUs, I use the same system. It's going to be an AMD X570 motherboard. This is going to be the Asus Impact with the newest BIOS, which is the 2311. Of course, it's also running on Windows 10, the 2004 version, and I use 16 gigabytes of 3600 megahertz CL16 RAM with a Samsung NVMe drive. And for the games, the GPU that I had in the system is an NVIDIA RTX 3080 Founders Edition. Everything is running on a 1200 watt main gear power supply. A little bit overkill, but I just wanted to make sure to have as much headroom as possible. And I sort of built this test system with the soft tubing so I could easily swap in and out the different CPUs. The soft tubing comes back really easily, so I really liked using that. And of course, I'm always a big fan of liquid cooling. Months ago, I picked this case up at Micro Center. I did a previous build in it, and I just thought, we're doing AMD Team Red, so let's get a red case in here, and I always like the blue coolant. So the first CPU that we're going to talk about is going to be the 5600X. Now, this is going to be a 6-core, 12-thread CPU with a TDP of 65 watts, and it boosts to about 4.6 gigahertz. Now, even though you may not think much of it because it's just the 5600X, it's the entry-level one that's been announced so far, the numbers really show what an absolute gaming beast that something like this is. In many games, it actually keeps up or beats the 10900K. It's very competitive with it. If it's not beating it, in a lot of cases, it's very, very close. Even in Cinebench, the single core score, it actually does beat a 10900K, which is super impressive because the 10900K is Intel's fastest gaming chip, and it was the fastest gaming chip on the market, that is until Zen 3 appeared. And of course, something like the 5600X, you wouldn't even compare to a 10900K. You're more apt to compare it to maybe like a 10600K, which it readily beats in most benchmarks, including Cinebench, including TimeSpy, and in most gaming benchmarks and applications, you're going to see the 5600X absolutely spank the 10600K. So even if you compare it in certain games to the 10900K, it's still very, very competitive. And we get to the second point where that's going to be the price of the CPU. Now, it comes in at $299. And while yes, for gaming, it's beating a lot of these high-end CPUs from Intel, but we must still have a little bit of a caveat here. I believe that $299 for a 6-core, 12-thread processor in 2020 is still a little bit on the high side. That's why some budget buyers may want to wait until AMD eventually releases more competitive SKUs, like for example, maybe something like the 5600, which may not be clocked as highly, but may give you most of the performance of the 5600X at a reduced price. While it is a very good value for what the CPU is bringing to the table, but at only 6 cores and 12 threads, even though it performs really, really well, pricing certainly is a little bit on the high side, and it's definitely going to price a lot of more budget builders and PC gamers sort of out of that 200 to 300 price mark. Having said this, it doesn't take away from the chip. It's still an absolutely amazing gaming CPU, and it really trounces on the 3600, which is pretty much people's budget CPU of choice. But we do have to differentiate here the pricing between the 36 and 5600X. They're really not in the same level. They're not in the same level performance wise. The 5600 is going to be considerably better in gaming and single threaded applications. And also pricing wise, you can get a 3600 anywhere from 160 to 180 bucks. All of my performance testing was actually done with an RTX 3080, and when the 5600X was in play, it actually performed really well, not too far off something even like the 5900X. But still, I think as a mid-range CPU, there are going to be a lot of people who buy this CPU because they're going to get gaming performance that's on par pretty much with Intel's more expensive CPUs, and they'll also be able to take advantage of all the Ryzen 5000 integrations and features when you pair something like AMD's new RDNA 2 GPUs, like unlocking more memory performance and things of that nature. So overall, I think it does represent a pretty good value for what it is. And then let's talk about another point. How innovative is this CPU compared to everything else on the market? First, if we consider how good that Zen 3 is overall as a gaming architecture with lower latency, better IPC, higher boost clocks, certainly there has been a lot done here in terms of innovation on AMD side to have great multi-threaded performance as well as great gaming performance. Now, while the 5600X certainly does great in gaming, it doesn't have anything particularly too special about it like some of the higher end CPUs. It is still, after all, a 6-core, 12-thread CPU, which in the market now certainly is a lot more common, especially with 8-core plus CPUs appearing. But anyway, we do have to give kudos to AMD's new Zen 3 architecture that's going to encompass all the CPUs, but especially having great gaming performance even on the lower end SKU like this, I think it certainly is going to make everybody very happy. Just like many people were happy with the 3600 giving almost 8700K levels of performance, I think people certainly will be very ecstatic about the 5600X giving almost 10700 or even nearing 10900K levels of performance at a much lower TDP, a much more efficient performance per watt. And even though it's not necessarily a budget CPU, it's still kind of a fair price, under $300 for the performance that it's putting out. And lastly, in the market, the 5600X compared to all the other Ryzen CPUs, as well as the Intel CPUs, what will the enthusiasts and gamers think of it? What's going to be the overall brand appeal? Well, first, AMD is extremely popular with enthusiasts now, and rightfully so. They they've really tried to go after the hearts of gamers and enthusiasts, putting out great products that perform really well, much more efficient, and in general do cost less than the competition if you compare the performance that they're putting out. So I'm going to be giving it the classical score, basically ranking it on the different 4 categories that I spoke about. First is going to be performance. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Now, I'm not going to give it a 5 out of 5 because it is only 6-core 12-thread, but we can't ignore the amazing single core performance that you're getting for the watts that it's putting out for the price that the CPU is at. The number 2 score will be the value or the price to performance. Now, for a 6-core 12-thread CPU, $299 certainly is a little bit more on the high end. That's why I might recommend for people to wait until the 5600 comes out, but I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5 on the value score. And then the third score will be the innovation aspect. And while Zen 3 has great performance improvements in general, great performance per watt, very good IPC, lower latency, higher boost clocks, it is a very solid performer. There's just nothing too groundbreaking here. And the last score is going to be the brand appeal and the aesthetic. Now, this being the 5600X, first it's going to get a lot of points because enthusiasts really love AMD right now. So I'm going to give it about a 3.5. The 5600X is going to be a very straightforward, great performing gaming CPU. Of course, it's not quite going to have the appeal of something like a 5900X or something that reaches a lot more power and is a lot more impressive. And I think a lot of gamers, even those with high-end GPUs, will be happy to have this in their system. So the Ryzen 5600X is going to get a total score of 14 out of 20, which certainly isn't bad at all. So now we level up a little bit and we get into the Ryzen 5800X. Now this is going to be an 8-core, 16-thread CPU, $449. It's going to boost to about 4.7 gigahertz and have a TDP of 105 watts, certainly more than the 65 watt TDP of the 5600X. If the 5600X was already nipping at the heels of the 10900K, the 5800X certainly gets much closer in most games, and some games beating it as well. In fact, the Cinebench score for single core certainly is considerably better than even the 10900K, and the 10900K technically isn't even the competition for the 5800X. That's going to fall to the 10700K, which the 5800X is going to beat even more readily. Just like with the 5600X, all of the Zen 3 improvements in the architecture, mainly sort of the better IPC, lower latency, as well as higher boost clocks, will serve to make the 5800X not only a great performer in these workstation loads and benchmarks, but also a great gaming performer even at 1080p high refresh rate gaming, where the CPU load is going to be considerably more than something like 1440p or 4K. The 5800X truly shines here. Now, performance wise, it isn't always the number 1 outright best. That's going to be reserved for some of the higher end Ryzen 5000 SKUs, but certainly for 8-core 16-thread, it's a great improvement over the 3800X. And in gaming, it's almost everything that you could ask for. It's almost a sweet spot at 8-core 16-thread. Certainly the performance is very impressive. And then we get to the price to performance ratio at $449. Certainly it's going to be more expensive than the 5600X, and it's more expensive than Intel's 10700K, but I think it definitely has the performance to back it up. Even though I don't think it's the perfect price to performance ratio, I do feel that at least it's better to get an 8-core 16-thread CPU if your budget allows at $449 rather than something maybe like the 5600X, which would be better suited cheaper, like in the form of a 5600 that maybe comes in at $250 or $220. $450, which is going to be considerably cheaper than a 10900K. I think 8-core 16-thread that performs this well certainly is a pretty good value. Now, in terms of the innovation and the special factor for the 5800X, we've seen 8-core 16-thread CPUs across the board for the last several years, but certainly at this performance with this great IPC, great multi-threaded performance, it's certainly getting considerably more innovative, and at that price point of $450 certainly makes it a much more attractive CPU. That's why I also think it's sort of appeal in general within the AMD ecosystem of Ryzen 5000. I think a lot of people that maybe don't want to settle just for the 5600, but they want something a little bit beefier, a lot of people certainly will go for the 5800X until something like a 5700 or something like that comes out where it's a little bit cheaper with close performance. performance. For now, I think a lot of people that want a little bit more power, a little bit more future-proof with 8-core 16-thread certainly will and should go for the 5800X, as I think it's certainly priced fairly well. So for the classical score for performance, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Still great performance, great improvements in the Zen 3 architecture, but of course we've seen 8-core 16-thread CPUs before, like with the 9900K, but the performance and the performance per watt for this CPU certainly is very, very good. For the price to performance ratio, I'm going to give this about a 3.5. $449 certainly is a pretty good price for what you're getting. Of course, it's not going to be the perfect value. It's not the best deal in the world, but if you include all of the great improvements to the Zen 3 architecture to get a CPU that performs this well for $450, I think 3.5 out of 5 is pretty fair. When we talk about innovation and sort of where this chip is taking us, 8-core 16-thread definitely I think is going to be the minimum for future-proofing. That's why I mentioned the 5600X is a little bit short at 6-core 12-thread, as well as that CPU performs. I really do think you need at least 8-core 16-thread. So I'm going to give this score 3.5 out of 5. And last, in terms of its overall brand appeal compared to Intel, like we said before, AMD, very popular with enthusiasts, and especially something like this, a 5800X, I think is going to have more weight with the enthusiast community than even the 5600X. I'm going to give this about a 4 out of 5. I think a lot of people will be very interested to jump and go into this type of CPU. Giving the 5800X a total score of 15 out of 20, just a little bit better than the 5600X. And of course, we're always calculating the price and the value within this, so it's not like every CPU would just go up incrementally. It's going to depend on the value it's providing for the price that's on hand. Now, the 5600X is the only one that's going to come with a Wraith Stealth cooler, so that helps the value proposition a little bit more. At least you don't have to buy a separate cooler. But for all the other CPUs that we're going to be talking about, they will not come with coolers, so something to keep in mind when you're budgeting for the CPU. And now we start to hit the big leagues, and that's going to be the 5900X, and it gets the Ryzen 9 moniker. Now, this is going to be 12-core, 24-thread, and coming in at a low TDP of 105 watts. Similar to the 5800X. Now, in terms of performance, this in general is going to be kind of compared against the 10900K, but in almost every case, this CPU certainly is now going to be the gaming king, as AMD said. The benchmarks really prove it. Not only in synthetic benchmarks like Cinebench R20, it pretty handedly beat the 10900K. Also, in all of the other gaming benchmarks, in general, in most games, it seems to be pretty easily beating the 10900K. When it doesn't, it's pretty close to most games. So when you consider the cost, the efficiency, and the power that the 5900X is putting out, this is certainly one of the best performing CPUs that we have ever seen. And this one was actually the CPU that impressed me the most, even more than the 5950X, which is an absolute monster as well. The 5900X, really, really impressive, not only with its multi-threaded performance. Remember, this is still a 12-core 24-thread CPU that will absolutely do fantastic in workstation workloads, multi-threaded applications. The gaming performance is absolutely amazing for a CPU like this. Not only is it faster than a 10900K, it's also more efficient. So the price of about $550, which isn't too far off from the 10900K, for the performance that you're getting, 12-core, 24-thread, extremely fast gaming performance with its better IPC, higher boost clocks. This really is, as AMD said before, and now confirmed by all of these benchmarks, it really is impressive, and it really is the gaming king CPU. I think it's really the sweet spot if you want a high-end CPU that's going to do everything. So for the price, I certainly think it's priced very, very well. And I even think it's a better value than something like the 5800X and even possibly the 5950X. So certainly in terms of the performance and the pricing, it's very much in that sweet spot. Now, in terms of its innovation, this is where I think this is going to be probably the most important Ryzen 5000 CPU. 12-core, 24-thread is nothing to sneeze at. A few years ago, 10-core, 24-thread from Intel, like the 6950X, which cost $2,000, was pretty much the top of the game, and that even wasn't that long ago. Now we have something with more cores and considerably faster gaming performance for what amounts to be almost just a quarter of the price. That's certainly pretty impressive. This is going to combine all of the other elements, including being 12-core, multi-threaded, the even higher gaming performance, to really really make the absolute sweet spot. So that's why if we talk about sort of the brand appeal of this CPU within AMD compared to everything else, this may almost be the Halo CPU, very close with the 5950X, that pretty much every enthusiast is going to want to get their hands on. So let's give it a classical score. Performance has to be 5 out of 5. I mean, it's the best performing CPU. It's super efficient. The performance per watt is amazing. No way that you can't give this one a 5 out of 5. For now, it's one of the best CPUs I've ever tested. Very happy with it. The price at $549, I think it's a great value for what you're getting. It's not that far off from the 10900K, but it has considerably better performance in multi-threaded applications. It's more efficient, and now for the first time, it also has better performance in gaming. So for the value category, I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. In terms of the innovation, it's also going to get a 4.5 out of 5, not only because Zen 3 brings together so many improvements, but everything's packaged in a 12-core, 24-thread CPU that not only can do all of your content creation, but it's also going to be the fastest gaming CPU, so you can't ask for too much more out of that. For the brand appeal within the AMD ecosystem, I think this is going to get a 4 out of 5. A lot of gamers definitely are going to want this. It's the gaming king. It doesn't have quite the heavyweight hatchet that the 5950X does, but for the price, it certainly is the sweet spot. Now, this 5950X, because of everything that we spoke about with its performance per watt, the price, the value that you're getting, also having such high multi-threaded performance, this CPU is going to get my Editor's Choice Award. And this is going to be the best award that I give sort of to the best products that I review. It's actually going to be a very rare award. I'm really only going to give it to the best of the best. And I'm not going to give it to every Ryzen 5000 CPU, not even the 5950X. I really think the 5900X deserves it. For me, this CPU is the sweet spot. Not only is it priced at $549, much cheaper than the 5950X, the gaming performance at the efficiency that it is absolutely mind-blowing. I'm very happy to have a CPU like this, and I think this CPU is what represents the future of enthusiast gaming. And last but not least, we come to the 5950X. In terms of performance, this is a monster 16-core, 32-thread CPU, surprisingly also at only 105 TDP for its power. That's certainly very impressive. The performance per watt here, it's absolutely crazy. And if you guys look at the benchmarks, even the synthetic benchmarks, not to mention the gaming benchmarks, this certainly is a top performer in every single category. And what's unique about this, I mean, it's bringing sort of what used to be enthusiast level, high-end 2000 CPU performance into something that's considerably cheaper. For the most part, this CPU, along with the 5900X that we mentioned before, really gives most of the Intel CPUs, including the 10900K, either a run for their money at the highest end games, or just outright beats them in most of the games. And then of course, in the benchmarks like Cinebench, something like this is going to absolutely spank the 10900K. In fact, in my main system with an X570 godlike motherboard, my main CPU was the 3950X. Of course, now it's going to be replaced by the 5950X, and I also have a Rampage 6 X299 with an 18-core 10980XE. Now, you would think that an Intel CPU that really now is $1,000, it used to be $2,000, and Intel cut the price down to $1,000. Of course, that CPU more or less beat the 3950X technically, even though in terms of the price it was much more expensive, and the 3950X certainly came close in a lot of cases. Now, the 5950X absolutely destroys the 10980XE. Even if we look at something like Cinebench stock, I was able to get pretty much around 10,000 for the multi-core score. With the 10980XE at much higher power consumption, you would have to really overclock it a pretty crazy amount to be able to reach that. And the 5950X, even with some not too exaggerated overclocks, you can probably easily reach over 11,000 Cinebench score. Not only to mention that in most games, this CPU is boosting up to 4.9 already, so it's a great performer in games, and of course in any type of workstation applications, it's going to be absolutely unbelievable. And then of course we talk about price at $799. It certainly is an expensive and high-end CPU, but if you think that the high-end CPUs that have this type of performance used to cost $2,000 just a few years ago, you're really getting a pretty good deal. Not to mention that look at the amazing multi-threaded performance that you're getting. you're not really skimping out on gaming performance at all. If you went with like a Threadripper, yeah, they have absolutely amazing performance for multi-threaded workloads, but generally in gaming performance, even the most expensive Threadripper CPUs certainly aren't the best, and a lot cheaper CPUs can easily beat them at gaming, but the case is no longer the same with the 5950X. $799 certainly is going to be for the niche enthusiast. Not everybody has to get this. Like I mentioned before, I think the sweet spot is going to be the 5900X, sort of for like the ultimate gaming CPU, but for somebody who's also doing content creation or simply wants the best, certainly around $800 seems more than fair for a CPU like this. In terms of its innovation, that's where I think this is also like the 5900X. Very important because it's bringing those previously $2,000 CPUs down to a more reasonable level of $800. I mean, look at what Intel had to do to their X299 lineup. They had to basically slash all the prices in half, and they still can't be competitive with something like this. So in terms of the gaming performance, the multi-threaded loads you're getting for 105 watt TDP, I mean, this has innovation written all over it. Very impressive. And of course, in terms of its sort of brand appeal in AMD, as well as in general in the high-end enthusiast community, this will be sort of the Halo CPU that people aspire to, or anybody that wants the best will get. Of course, we have the Threadripper above this, but talking about the mainstream CPUs, this really makes a lot more sense for 99% of people, even compared to Threadripper, unless you need a certain application that will take advantage of like a 24 core or 32 core CPU, then you're a very specific use case. But I think as a gamer, the 5950X certainly is the Halo product, and while it's not necessarily the best value proposition, I think the 5900X is. Certainly for the performance that you're getting here, you really can't complain too much. So if we're going to give it a classical score, in terms of performance, has to be 5 out of 5. I mean, even though technically the 5900X is a little bit better at gaming, this one is 16 core, 32 thread, and it still games almost just as good as the 5900X, better than a 10900K in a lot of cases. So this has to get a 5 out of 5. Absolutely monster performance. In terms of the value, I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5. I did think about almost giving it a 3.5 out of 5, but here are my reasoning on this. Even though it is a $799 CPU, it has no competition in the market. And even a workstation user, compare this type of performance to something that's going to cost well over $1,000 with the Threadripper CPUs, or even what Intel used to cost a few generations ago. So looking at the much more expensive competition, and this is performing pretty much just as good for most people, I consider it to be a fantastic value for the price that you're paying. And for the innovation score, 4 out of 5. Extremely innovative, not only with Zen 3 architecture, but that they can bundle this together in a 16-core, 32-thread CPU. Very, very impressive, especially having amazing gaming performance. Now, you don't have to choose between multi-threaded workloads or gaming performance. You can get pretty much everything in one. And for its brand appeal, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Now, this will be the Halo CPU for a lot of people, but because of its higher price, certainly it will keep most people from actually buying it. So that's why I think 4 out of 5 is fair. I still think most people should go for the 5900X if you're going to be a really high-end gamer. And if you're a budget gamer, the 5600X, a little bit on the high spot, even though it does come with that Wraith stealth cooler. You may want to wait for the 5600, but overall, I do think the 5900X is going to be the overall sweet spot, beating out even the 5950X just because it's priced a little bit better, and it has more than enough performance for gaming and for workstation uses that I think will satisfy 99% of people. That's why the 5950X I gave my Editor's Choice Award. Alright guys, so to summarize, all 4 of these Zen 3 Ryzen 5000 CPUs are extremely impressive. And then when you take into account that they're going to have synergy and give you more memory performance, unlocking that performance from RDNA 2 GPUs in the future certainly does seem very bright. We have a lot of great technologies already embedded in this Zen 3 architecture, so this is definitely one of the best CPU platforms that we have ever seen. Even if you're getting a lower end CPU all the way up to the 5950X, you'll be able to take advantage of all the PCIe lanes, all of the power that the X570 platform puts out. And of course, while I think the 5950X really is the sweet spot for a high-end CPU right now, where you're going to get the best gaming performance, the best workstation performance, it's hard to go wrong with any of the other CPUs. Even the 5600X being only 6-core, 12-thread, it presents a terrific value as a gaming CPU and really beats everything that comes before it, and certainly starts to eliminate a considerable full amount of any type of bottlenecks that you would get with the new RTX GPUs and AMD's own RDNA 2 GPUs. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment down below. Remember to subscribe for more content like this. Smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.